Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the ICG's Digital Academy webinar series. This is Sally Alsop, a member of the ICG committee. So in today's webinar, you'll be hearing from ICG member Iris Griffiths of Across Research. Iris is a qualitative market researcher specializing in international research projects, particularly in Brazil and other Latin American countries. She's also a translator, interpreter, and cross-cultural communication specialist who has been working in these combined fields with market research for the last 30 years. Iris is also a teacher of interpreting and translation modules for universities and courses. In her webinar today, Iris will take us through how to improve and optimize the quality of the interpreting in international research projects when working with interpreters in person, remotely, or in a hybrid situation. The best way of briefing an interpreter to make sure you make the most of the interpreter as a tool to get more insights for your market research project, and interpreting from the interpreter's point of view and what impacts on the quality of the interpreter's output. She'll also be talking about simultaneous interpreting and the changes in the interpreting industry, which can be a benefit or a threat for market research projects. Iris is happy to take questions at the end, so please type them into the question box as usual as we go through, and we'll read them out during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Before I hand over to Iris, here are the next webinars to note in your diaries. Some of them are open for registration now. Also, there are still sponsorship opportunities for a couple of forthcoming webinars if anyone is interested. It costs £100 for a lot of exposure on our website, mailers, and social media, and of course, on the day. Oops. So our speaker today is Iris Griffiths from Across Research, and I'll now hand over to Iris. Okay, Iris?
Okay, I think that I'm there, aren't I?
Yeah, I can see your slide.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Sally. Thank you, Lucy, and all of you from the committee for giving me the opportunity to speak again with ICG colleagues. And thank you, all of you here with me in this session. My reason to want to speak with you about interpreters in market research is because I often hear from market researchers saying that they had good and bad experiences with interpreters. As an interpreter, I think that you always should have good experiences with interpreters. And basically, interpreting and market research are two of my professional passions. Although market research was not my first professional passion, actually, I fell in love with market research very early in life. To start with, I actually wanted to be a journalist. You know, from a very, very young age, I wanted to be a journalist. And as every child who wants to be a journalist, I was advised to read a lot and to read about everything. So at about 12, whilst reading an Agatha Christie book, I saw the need of learning English just because I couldn't understand something in Portuguese and no one could explain what that was. So learning English at 12 meant for me traveling 2 hours each way in a non-tarmac road by coach to the next town to get 45 minutes of English lessons per week. So by the time that I finished secondary school, I still wanted to be a journalist, but I also wanted to be a translator, the type of translator that translates books specifically, and I also wanted to be an interpreter. And I wanted to be an interpreter just because I had watched on TV an interpreter working live in an Oscar ceremony of some sort. And I thought that it would be very glamorous if I could rub shoulders with actors and have them dependent on me for communication. So I went to the university to study journalism as planned, and I studied journalism in the morning. In the afternoon, I worked as an intern in a newspaper that it was specialized in political affairs. And in the evening, I went back to the university to do translation and interpreting. So it was in my job that my boss sent me to this research company to collect some research results of a study that they had commissioned. And when I arrived there in that research company that happened to be the largest political research company in the country at the time, that I met a group of people not much older than me who seemed to be having a lot more fun than me. And they were like sociology students, the majority of them. And they were going all over Brazil, traveling a lot, and they were interviewing people. And they were helping with the transition of the country from dictatorship to democracy. I'm talking about the mid-80s here. And that visit to the research company led me away from journalism forever and landed me into an exciting career of political and market research. And it also enabled me to use my skills as a translator, whilst I was still studying, and as an interpreter way earlier than I thought possible. So by the time that I finished university and came to the UK, I already knew that some people learned foreign languages to speak with foreign people. And I learned that some people learn foreign language to use the language as a tool. And I am in the second group. English, Portuguese, and Spanish are my working tools. So I will talk to you about interpreting and about interpreters, and I know that you already have some experience with that, and you probably have a lot of knowledge in this area. But I hope to build up on this knowledge, and if I do that, the benefit that you have is having better experiences with interpreters, and you will improve the consistency of getting good interpreters for your market research projects, and you will improve the insights that you get via interpreters in your international projects. When we look at interpreting and qualitative research, definitely interpreting is a resource that is widely used in market research. And I think that market researchers, in a general way, they have a very low expectation in relation to interpreters. And that is so much so that hit and miss is sort of defines how people talk about the quality of the previous experiences that they had with interpreters. So I've been asking myself for a long time, why interpreters in market research industry, why interpreting generates such a low expectation? And interpreting is a tool that is used in other industries very effectively. So, of course, I've been thinking as well how I could tackle this problem. And on the other hand, we as market researchers are being challenged more and more to add value to what we offer our clients. And qualitative research is changing fast, and the clients want more and more for less. So, in my opinion, I think that interpreting is where you can add more value in your qualitative research project, at least in the projects that you are working internationally. And my first tip for you to improve your experience of working with interpreters is to get the right professional from the job. And by that I mean make the most of the difference between translators and interpreters, because they are not the same thing. In the English language, normally translation is used as an umbrella term to cover both translation, which is written, and interpreting, which is spoken. So, but you cannot really say that translation and interpreting is the same thing, or working with them is the same thing, because this is the same than saying that quantitative research is the same thing as qualitative research. So for you as a market researcher, does it matter that you are working with a translator or with an interpreter? Well, I think it does, because it is easier overall for you to find an interpreter who also trains to be a translator than finding a translator who can interpret. Getting the right professional for your project impacts on the quality of the interpreting that you are getting, and it pays to know the difference between the different professionals that you will come across, because then you can brief the professional accordingly, and most importantly, you can manage your own expectations accordingly. So another thing that I notice a lot here in the UK market research industry is to say that you need a simultaneous translator. There is a French film that it was released last year. It's a thriller crime type of film, and it is a very interesting film if you are into that. But I will show you just the trailer for that film, because the trailer actually.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very
well, you see.
The final book of the Daedalus trilogy, The Man Who Did Not Want to Die.
C'est un best-seller mondial.
Translation will begin in December.
T'es prêt à enfermer tes traducteurs dans un bunker, à les traiter comme du bétail?
Vous avez fait bon voyage? Vous ne pourrez garder aucune trace de votre passage ici.
La confiance reine.
Ce travail commun de traduction pour une sortie mondiale simultanée est une première. Vous pouvez vous estimer chanceux après vous. Nous avons pris toutes les précautions du monde. Isoler les traducteurs, confisquer les portables, couper Internet.
Это не просто триллер. Это фундаментальный текст.
So, for us, this film, all interpreters that watch this film, what we liked is because already in the beginning, you can see what we as interpreters imagine when you are looking for simultaneous translators. We just imagine that you want a bunch of translators working together in the same place at the same time, but in different languages. So I like this film for that, but the film actually is quite interesting for all other reasons. So my second tip for you, it would be adapt your moderation style to the type of interpreters that you have at hand. And this is connected with what you had before. No interpreter will tell you that you should not use a certain interpreter, but you should use the interpreter that is appropriate for your own project. And when it comes to moderation, you have to adapt the moderation to the style, your moderation style to the type of interpreters that you have at hand, because interpreting impacts or should impact on the way that you moderate. So to try to moderate with an interpreter, listening to what you are doing, or depending on you, to moderate in the same way that you moderate, without the interpreter, is the same than trying to moderate online in the same way that you moderate face-to-face. You have to adapt. In the market research, we normally have three types of interpreters working in the projects. You have interpreters that work simultaneously, you have interpreters that work in consecutively, and you have interpreters that work in chuchotage mode. This is the three sort of main modes of interpreting that you're going to see in a market research setting. And I'm going to talk about them a little bit. So simultaneous interpreters, they work with or without equipment. A lot of people mix up simultaneous interpreters with conference interpreters. They are not the same thing. Every conference interpreter is trained to work simultaneously with equipment. And of course, if they choose, they may work without equipment, but that's what they do. And they are trained to work behind a booth with acoustics that is favorable to them and in a very specific environment. And this is one of the modes that they are trained at, simultaneous. So in market research, the interpreter will follow, a simultaneous interpreter will follow the speaker in real time. For most languages, independent of where that interpreter works, the interpreter is able to start interpreting within 3 to 5 seconds after the speaker starts speaking. And what is the implication of that for market research? Well, this is at the beginning. The interpreter starts at 3 to 5 seconds lagging behind the speaker. In a market research context, when you moderate, if you are moderating and have an interpreter conveying what you are moderating to someone else, you have to bear in mind that that interpreter started after you to convey the information. So 3 to 5 seconds. But very quickly, that lagging time will increase. And you have to bear that in mind when you are probing your respondents, because that avoids, at a minimum, clients sending messages to you to probe something that you already probed and causing distractions on your moderation. And if you are the one that is listening to the moderation via an interpreter, you also have to bear that in mind, because that will impact on the insights that you are getting from the interpreter. One of the ways that you notice that is people get a bit confused about what participant, what respondent said what. But it's a bit more problematic than that. If you do not take that in mind and do not adapt and do not work with your interpreter about how the moderation will be done, compromises will be made, you want it or not. And if you don't take control of that compromise, the interpreter will, because that is part of the role of being an interpreter. And it is not guaranteed that you as an interpreter will take the best decision for your client or the best decision for you as a moderator. If the interpreter doesn't know, the interpreter will do what he or she knows best. Take control of what you are going to hear. Another mode of interpreting that we have in market research is consecutive. In consecutive interpreting, the interpreter works without equipment, always without equipment. The interpreter will hear the speaker first, and he or she will convey the information in the target language when the speaker has a natural silence pause. If you are working with a trained, experienced conference interpreter who is trained in consecutive interpreting, that interpreter, with the aid of notes, can memorize up to 5 minutes of conversation. And if you are carrying out a market research interview with the help of a consecutive interpreter, you have to bear in mind a few things. Firstly, you have to adapt the duration of the interview according to the interpreter or the person that you are using as an interpreter at hand. If you are using an interpreter who is trained in consecutive interpreting, that interpreter will take at least 50% more time, will add 50% more time in your interview. If you are working with a professional interpreter who is not trained in consecutive interpreting, you are not going to manage to do that interview without taking twice as long. And if you are working with someone that is not trained in interpreting, you have to be aware that that person will be able to speak, or that person will be interrupting you every 1, 2, 3 sentences max. And then that person will start to compromise on the message. So the interview itself can take forever. But what is worse in that case is the dynamics of interviewing, because it will change and you probably won't be able to hold the research participant attention for very long. The same way that you have to pay attention where you are positioning your interpreter, because what you don't want is the participant paying attention to the interpreter. And there are rules of where you place the interpreter, and there are rules where you can get more from the interpreting without the physical person of the interpreting. Because at the end of the day, when you are getting an interpreter, you are not getting the person, you are just getting the voice and the knowledge behind that voice, just that. So another type of interpreting that you see in market research, and this is one that I use a lot in the markets that I work, and I work a lot with it in the Asian countries that I provide services for, is chuchotage. Chuchotage is also called like whispering interpreting. In market research, you can use I use that with portable equipment, and the interpreter works simultaneously, so it doesn't add time to the interview. And the interpreter whispers the interview via a device such as this one here, the white one. And the listeners will receive that information via a headset that is connected with a listening device, which is very small, very discreet, and is not intimidating at all. And that helps. This sort of interpreting is ideal if you are doing in-home interviews, or if you are doing interviews in a workplace, but your client is with you, or if you are the moderator working with a local-based moderator in the target country. And this is perfect as well for you to do on-the-move interviews. I've been doing a lot of ethnographic work where the client wants to see what's going on. And lately, at least in some of the Asian markets, some of the moderators decided that they want to use the interpreter, and they want, even though they do not speak the language, they want to be doing the interview themselves. So if you go into that sort of, if you want to do that, this is the best equipment to use, because you can make the most of the interpreter and you can make the most of the situation without intimidating your respondent or adding too much for the respondent or the participant to think that is strange. Of course, you can do chuchotage or whispering interpreting without equipment, and the interpreter again will work simultaneously, but the interpreter will have to whisper the information on your ear, because the idea again is that the interpreter doesn't disturb the situation, doesn't disturb that setting. If you are working with an interpreter doing whispering without equipment, if the interpreter tells you that he can do more than 45 minutes on his own without a reasonable break, you have to ask yourself why the interpreter is happy to do that. Something will happen and it won't be chuchotage. This is because when you work whispering, it is exactly that. You have to be able to maintain a very clear communication of the information in a tone of voice that is whispering, using a part of your throat that you normally do not use in a day-to-day life for a long period of time. All interpreters that try to do that without breaks, they lose the voice. So we don't do it. we just, we have to have breaks because it is very taxing for our voice and for, the mechanics of the work. So with that, I just want to say, adapt to the style of the interpreter, because you want it or not, someone will lose something with the interpreter, because the interpreter is an element that should be taken into account, not just be coped with. And I think that is better to integrate the interpreter into the process than just use it as, oh, let's solve this, language problem here. Another thing that, another tip that I think that you should take into account, and I hope that it will help you, is getting the interpreter with the right working language. So getting the interpreter with the right language combination for what you want from that interpreter. And it does change. Perhaps you are the moderator listening to the interpreter, you have a name, but your client, if you are not, you are the one moderating and your client is listening, perhaps the objective of the client is a bit different than yours in the sense of what he wants to get from watching, from observing that interview. And you have to adapt accordingly. And in the way that you're going to do that is by understanding what are working languages. The quick way to find out in market research if you have the right language combination for your market research project is asking the interpreter what is the active and what is the passive language combination. And this is very good as well if you want to spot an interpreter that is professionally trained from an interpreter that is not professionally trained. Interpreters, they work into active language and passive languages. And the active languages are always the language A and language B. And then all the other languages are considered passive languages if they are not working with them actively. And they are the C languages. So for example, I am a conference interpreter with Portuguese A, English B, and Spanish C. When I tell you that, I want you to understand that A is my native language. I am fluent in my native language in whatever sort of subject that you give me 10 minutes to read about it. I will be able to acquire the knowledge necessary to work in my language with the vocabulary that you need. And I work actively from my B language into A, my native language. So my B language is English. What does that mean for you? It means that I am an interpreter that works from Portuguese into English, and I can work also from English into Portuguese. So I can do both ways. But that you should understand something quite important about it. It means that I'm not native of English, and it doesn't matter how long I'm going to study the language, I will never speak like a native. So you have to compromise on what you expect from me and in an interpreting situation. And then I have a passive language that is Spanish. That means that I am able to interpret from Spanish into my A language or into my B language. Perhaps I can also do from to A and B, but normally you just specialize in one of them. And why that is important for you to understand all these A, B, C? Well, if you are working in market research, you are going to meet mainly interpreters that speak into the B language. So you have English and you go to whatever country you go, your interpreter will be always working to the B language. And in some countries that you work, actually your interpreter is working to the C language. So English for them is not even the language that they can do the work the best. So if you ask me as an interpreter, I think that I am a good interpreter in Portuguese. Of course, I will say that I am a good interpreter in English as well, but you are going to see me at my best when I work into my native language. And across your lives, you are going to meet very only a minority of interpreters that have 2A languages. Here in Europe is, you can get some interpreters with 2A languages, but this is really a minority. You can have interpreters with 1A language and several B languages. And if you meet interpreters that have like 3A languages, they are so rare that if you meet them, you hug them and tell them, I sent that hug. We interpreters, when we meet colleagues that have 3A languages, we just get amazed by them. And this is not because they speak the language, it's because they have that language as a working language. And working language, when you are talking about interpreters, means for a conference interpreter who already speaks a language, it means 2 years of intensive training. You cannot add another language, working language, to your portfolio without investing in years, hours plus hours of training, and also being able to maintain that language active all the time. Otherwise, in an interpreting situation, you cannot work. You just can't. You can work, you just don't do a good job. So, and that comes, all of that, knowing all of that, it will impact with how you brief the interpreter. And that is really important, I find. So you have to brief the interpreter for the needs of your project. You have to think what you want the interpreter to get out of that, of that group, of that interview that he's working with. And I'm going to tell you 2 stories, very short stories about briefing. Not long ago, I had to run a market research project with children in Brazil. This was about 3 years ago. And in all my projects, I just try to work with interpreters that already have experience in a market research setting. If I cannot get someone that is already experienced, I will take the time to train the person to work in my project. Of course, sometimes clients ask me to get an interpreter for the following day. I don't have time to train that interpreter, but I will give them a briefing about what to expect in market research. Market research is not the first port of call for an interpreter. The setting is completely different from what we normally work. And if you are in the interpreting industry, market research is not an area that interpreters want to work in. Because there is a lot of misconceptions and misunderstanding about market research and what is expected from the interpreter. So going back to that project in Brazil, I brought my interpreter in, but she was a regular colleague that worked regularly with me. And 2 days before the first interview, she had to cancel with me. And this is not a problem, because normally whoever is providing the interpreter to you, they will have backups. And I just decided for that project that instead of calling another colleague that it was already very experienced, I decided to try someone new. This was a guy that I had worked a few months before in a conference, a large conference. I was sharing the booth with him, extremely good interpreter. And I brought him into the project and I briefed him about the project. And because the project was with children, I was very concerned that he was updated with the vocabulary used by children, in that specific context of the research. And then, of course, the interpreter told me, oh, Iris, don't worry, I have children the same age that you are interviewing, so on and so forth. Came the first interview. We had 2 boys, 7 and 8 years old. The interview starts, and I was following the interview from the UK, and I was using a remote service from the facility, and I could hear the moderator and I could hear the interpreter. I had clients in New Zealand, Australia, that said that they were going to follow the interviews. One of them logged in for this interview, and he stayed in the interview for about 15 minutes and log off again. But at this point, the client is there listening to the interpreter, and I noticed that the interpreter started to lag behind the children's speech. And then this was like 10 minutes. I say something is wrong with the interpreter here. And came to 20 minutes, I was already sure that the interpreter was skipping the children's opinion and he was getting the information via the moderator. So I had someone from my team put the interpreter on the phone and I talked to the interpreter. The first thing that the interpreter told me is, I cannot follow what these children are saying. I don't know if it's because they are speaking too fast. And then I continued talking with this interpreter, and then we decided that he wasn't the best profession that I could have for that job. I let him go, and I had another interpreter coming for the other interview that happened 1 hour later. When I talked to my client, this one that watched the first 10 minutes of the interview, and I explained why I changed the interpreter, he said, well, I don't think that you needed to change because I was getting something, I was getting an idea from what it was happening in the interview. And then I told him, well, that is exactly the problem. If you are using and paying for an interpreter, you shouldn't be expecting just to get an idea from what is going on. You are supposed to have an exact understanding of what is going on in that project. So this is, this is just to illustrate where it was his expectation and where it was my expectation. And, an interpreter, if you tell them what you expect from them, they will tell you if they have difficulties. And you have to adapt to whatever you have. The other story happened after the lockdown here in the UK. I had a colleague that rang me because someone told her she had been commissioned to do some interpreting during some interviews about COVID-19 in Brazil. Her job has been confirmed the day before. She just received the information that she was working during some interviews. And then she was preparing the way that an interpreter prepares. She already, by that point, had researched what it was the guidelines in Brazil about COVID, what the government posture in relation to COVID was, who was doing what, and what is the opinion, what are the statistics about it in the country. And she rang me when she received, on the day of the interview, she received some materials from the client and she saw my name. And when she saw my name there, she said, oh my God, I don't think these are interviews the way that I expect. This is market research interview. Because what is Iris doing here if she's not the interpreter? She knew that I worked in market research. She rang me and I explained to her exactly what we were expecting from her. I explained, the setup that we are going to work with, all remote. And I sent her the discussion guide and I explained to her, I gave an idea of what I was expecting people to talk about. So she hung up, and before she hung up, she told me, oh, I am very relieved. You saved me hours of preparing in the wrong direction. In the evening, the interpreter did her job. I did my moderation. We had all the challenges that, an interview online can have. And then the interpreter rang me the following day to say thank you. She said, if I hadn't talked to you before the interview, I would have probably given up on that interview yesterday. I wouldn't have finished interpreting for it because that is not the way that we expect the quality of sound as an interpreter. That is not, it was a bit too challenging. And then she said something that it was very interesting, I think. She said, actually, it was good talking to you because it gave me the confidence to, persist until the end. Because the interviews that you were doing is a bit more emotional that we interpreters are prepared for. So yeah, they talk a lot about emotional, and it was good to be able to prepare that in advance. So I knew exactly what you wanted to convey. So, and that finished the story. That is the whole of the story. But then it does bring the remote interpreting into light. We are all using remote work a lot more than before. And some people ask me if remote interpreting should be another game altogether. That image there is of a colleague of mine. At the beginning of the lockdown, we started to exchange images of our working setup, and actually she is one of my colleagues' setup for doing interpreting. So it's up to you. I don't know if it's another game altogether. For some people, it's the same thing that always happened. You know, nothing changed. Like in the market research industry, face-to-face interpreting came to a standstill at the beginning of the COVID impact worldwide. And like in the market research industry, a lot of interpreters were already interpreting, you know, in a remote environment before 2020. So they continue to do so, and they are in an advantage point at the moment. And a lot of interpreters who would never consider working remotely are now working remotely. In the same way that some interpreters that would never consider working for market research are now working in market researching settings. My colleague that I gave you an example is a person like that. She would never consider remote interpreting before or working in market research. So for those of you who are running international research projects and worried about overcoming the language problems, I tell you this: simple solutions still work the best, or at least in the most of cases works the best. The same pitfalls that you had working with interpreters face-to-face, you have with interpreters working online. And of course, you have to take into account all the other additional complications of working online. Complications or differences, whatever you want to call that. So when we're talking about interpreting online and how you can overcome the language barrier working remotely, I have a lot of people asking me if they should go bespoken. And I do ask them, well, do you need to go bespoken? Because it is exactly like the market research industry. You know, in this screen, for example, you have some of the online platforms that I am familiar with just in the context of market research. Some of these platforms are becoming quite popular now in 2020, and some are, you know, some are just adaptations of things that we had before, but they are just becoming more popular because people are using them more. Some of them are web streaming platforms, others are telecommunication apps, and others are remote simultaneous interpreting platforms that it was created with the interpreter in mind. So the interpreter will have everything that he or she had when it was working in a booth, for example, you know, and quality of sounds, and you have to certify with some of these companies to make sure that you are the interpreter with all the equipment that they need. And that, of course, is apart from your own knowledge. Good interpreting in market research does not depend on the platform alone. You know, just finding the platform is not what is going to give you a good interpreter. It still depends on the interpreter that you get and how much you can really prepare that interpreter for the setting that you are using him or her in. As long as you are depending on humans, remote interpreting for market research is still the same game, in my opinion. And of course, I thought, oh, I can give some demo of a few platforms, but I don't think that I will have time for that. So what I will do is just tell you about Zoom, because Zoom is a platform that is becoming quite popular among researchers. And Zoom actually can offer you a lot of, a lot of what you need from an interpreter or for overcoming language barriers. At the beginning of May, I had a client that came to me, and the client has a very limited budget. And of course, he had tried a few other options, and all the options were quite expensive. This client is linked with academia. And then I told them, well, why you don't use Zoom for that? Because the client was doing a series of conferences, presentations, that it would be streamed via different social medias and via a large newspaper in Brazil. So, the client already had the sound technicians working with it. So I told them, well, we can use Zoom, an interpreter, for what you want, doesn't need more than Zoom. And then we used Zoom for that client, and the client was over the moon because they already had Zoom, as a service there, and the interpretation was included because they were linked with the academia, and they had the academia Zoom service. So with Zoom, can you do interpreting in any language? Well, yes, you can. Zoom has dedicated channels for interpretation, which is like English, Portuguese, Spanish, German, Japanese, Chinese, and Korean. These are the languages that they have dedicated for it. But in a market research setting where we work just with one interpreter, you can use that interpreter for any language. However, whoever is depending on the interpreting will need to know that actually they are entering, for example, in the Korean channel to hear someone speaking in Danish. Because who does the interpreting is not the platform, it's the human. And that doesn't change anything. If you are also working with Zoom, you have to be aware that you have to create that session in market research with a random ID. You cannot use with personal ID because then the interpreting doesn't work. And if you are the Zoom host, the moderator, and the person responsible for assigning the interpreters, you have to be very strict with your actions and how you're going to do it. So go there way before you have to start, otherwise you are not going to have your interpreter working there, because Zoom locks the interpreter out if the session has started already. And I think that I have to finish, otherwise you won't have time to ask questions. So for me at the moment, I just want to keep this conversation going, and I thought that it was interesting to mention to the ICG that bit of my life. So they say that lockdown inspired a lot of people. For me, that has been the case because I took the plunge and I started a training program for interpreters who want to specialize in market research. And my intention is to continue talking with market researchers and understand what are the problems and how we can solve that. Because interpreters, like market researchers, work with meanings behind the word. The word is never what we are looking for. It's the meaning that we look for it, that we look behind, that is our aim. And interpreters, like market research, work with precision. We work with accuracy in a sea of very uncertain data. And interpreters, like market researchers, are professionals who pride themselves in being able to solve problems in matters that we knew nothing about 3 months before. So I just think that there is an opportunity for us to match this professional a bit better in our market research projects, and then that will definitely generate better insights, or at least better quality of the insights that you get. So if you have any questions, I am ready to take any questions that you may have. And of course, I can talk to you individually if you want about any aspect of interpreting that you may be curious about.
Thank you, Iris. That was fascinating, really insightful, and you've given us some excellent tips for when we're needing to work with an interpreter. So that was really, really good. We've got one couple of questions coming through. The first one is, I always work with simultaneous translation. You said we have to adapt our moderation to take into account the 3 to 5 second lag when moderating. How exactly do we do this? And what they mean by that is, what specifically should they do differently while moderating versus when it's not being translated?
Okay, the lag in time is just one of the things that you have to adapt to your interpreter. If you are interpreting without a translator, interpreter, whatever is the name that you want to give to them, you just are happy to just probe, from one to another. If someone overlap, if one is overlapping the other when they are speaking, it doesn't matter because you listen to both of them. But an interpreter can listen to only one person at a time. So if you are listening to your moderator, your local base moderator, if he is doing the interpreting, one of the things that I tell my own moderators to do is, every time that there is an overlapping conversation, even when you understood that, you repeat what it was said with the words of the respondent. Not what you understood, but what you heard from the respondent, with the same words that it was used, because that will enable the client that is with me, and in my case, I work a lot with research colleagues that are already taking the insights whilst they are listening, and for them it's important to know what the respondent, what the participant is saying. So this is one of the things that I tell my moderator to do. Another thing that my moderators have to do is always repeat names, like, we do a lot of medical research, so repeat the names that the doctors say, the name of medication or the name of a condition, anything that is that sounds a bit more confusing. Like every language has letters that are confusing for the interpreter to be able to pick up. And if there are numbers, you have also to repeat that, because that is a bit harder for the interpreter. For the moderator, it's just bearing in mind that they are working with someone that is giving information behind them. But remotely, one of the things that I notice now is clients, they are listening to the interpreter in one device, I am moderating the other, and then they keep sending notes. Oh, can you ask them that? And then I have to write to them, I already asked that. I'll talk to you about it later. Because they keep just asking, can you probe that? When you already probed. But the interpreter could not follow everything that you are saying, because you are moderating too fast, and the interpreter just, skip a few things, or the interpreter decides on his, because he has to take some decisions to not lag behind for too long. The interpreter just decides, no, I'm not gonna pass that information. That is not important for me. That is what I understand that they want to hear from the research. And what is worse, sometimes the interpreter will focus on the moderator to get the information from the moderator instead of getting the information from the respondent. Too many people speaking. No one told the interpreter in who they should focus to get the information. The interpreter will get what is easier for them. The interpreter is human. And that is the sort of thing that you have to take into account. That lag in time will increase. You speak fast, it will increase, because interpreters just follow what you say. Or then the interpreter will reformulate what you say. Sometimes I hear people telling me that they did the group, and then the market research, the moderator said, oh no, the interpreter got that wrong. No, what the interpreter did is he couldn't get the whole information, so he reformulated the information. And in conference interpreting, that's what we do all the time. And this is the right thing to do in a conference interpreting. But in market research is not the right thing to do, because we don't want reformulation. We don't want you to understand the vocabulary of the interpreter. We want you to understand the vocabulary of the respondent. And I think that that's where we have a lot of problems in market research.
Okay, thank you, Iris. Another question. What is your view on interpreters? I think that's playing back the respondent's voice when they translate simultaneously. It does make it easier for listeners to follow, but is it good practice?
If you tell your interpreters, like when I am working with children, I tell my interpreters, can you just get the personality of the child? That interpreter will give me whatever that interpreter can give me. But I, as someone that have to listen to interpreters, I love to hear the personality of the respondent. Because if you don't tell the interpreter that, the interpreter will try to maintain a neutral tone of voice. Because we interpreters are trained, and that's what is expected of us in most of the settings that we work. Be always neutral. Someone is saying, I'm gonna kill you, trying to kill someone, you just say, yeah, I will kill you. So in a very neutral voice. So I think that, yes, if you can get your interpreter to do that, it is good, because it helps you to identify without having to be keeping an eye on the respondents, identify who is speaking what, and actually it will give you an idea of the respondent. In children's research, I always ask the interpreter to give me the voices, because some children, is the way that they speak that you get the insight, not necessarily what they say. And it's the enthusiasm that shows you that they are, they like or dislike whatever you are showing. And of course, if you tell the interpreter will give you all the gap words, or the words that you use that is like, wow, yeah, the interpreter will give you that. But normally, we interpreters do not work with that sort of thing. So if you don't tell them that you need that, the interpreter will just cut that, because they take, millésimes of seconds in their own brain to reformulate that information. So I hope I have answered the question. Yeah, if you can get the interpreter to do it, if you ask the interpreter will make an effort to do it.
Okay, now there's a question really for us rather than for you, Iris, although it starts with many thanks to Iris for a great presentation, so well done. It's been very useful. Will there be a recording available? Yes, there will be a recording available. I think it'll be put on the ICG website within the next 24, maybe 48 hours, but Lucy will do that. There was another comment that says, loving the images, especially Merkel and Macron. So, yeah. But I think that's all the questions for so far, unless somebody sends in a last minute one. But thank you very much indeed, Iris. That's been really, really fascinating.
Thank you all. This is something that I love talking about, of course. So, yeah.
You obviously know a huge amount about it, Iris. So thank you for sharing your experience with us. It's been really useful. Okay, so thank you everyone for logging in and for listening in. I hope you found it useful and fascinating too. And thanks again to Iris, and I hope you will have a lovely afternoon. Bye from us.
Bye.